All right, welcome to your own deep dive, tailored just for you. And today we're going to be looking into this guy, Douglas Franklin Wright, a convicted serial killer and executed in Oregon back in 1996. So I've got a lot of different sources for this deep dive: court records, biographical details, even a letter he wrote like right before his execution. The big question here is why, after years of these, horrifying crimes, would Wright confess to this unsolved murder and, kind of choose a faster end?
It's a really interesting question, and one that leads us down a path that is as disturbing as it is, intriguing. To really understand Wright's actions, I think we need to rewind all the way back to the beginning, his childhood and all that.
Yeah, okay, so let's rewind back to his early life. What was his childhood like? I have a feeling it wasn't exactly, a happy upbringing.
You're right about that. Far from it, actually. Wright was born in 1940, and his early years were marked by a lot of neglect, abandonment, things like that. His dad, an alcoholic, he pretty much disappeared from the picture and left Wright and his siblings to be raised by their mom, who, from what we can gather, really struggled to cope with everything. And there are also some indications of abuse, both physical and sexual.
That's, uh, that's really sad to hear. I mean, you can already start to see how those experiences, could have set the stage for the darkness that would eventually consume him.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but those early experiences, they can really cast a long shadow on a person's life. And in Wright's case, the darkness, they kind of manifested early on. He dropped out of high school. He was expelled from the Marines for sexually assaulting a 5-year-old. And later on, he actually admitted to assaulting over 70 young boys.
Wow, that's a pattern of predatory behavior. That's just, it's chilling. It feels almost calculated, like he was practicing or honing his, sinister skill set.
The thing that I find particularly troubling is the vulnerability of his victims, this targeting of individuals who were young and powerless. It's a recurring theme that we see throughout Wright's criminal history, unfortunately.
And it all kind of culminates in 1969 with the murders of Margaret Rosenberry and her granddaughter Gail Snelling,
Mm-hmm.
right in their Portland home.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was something really unsettling about this case in particular, wasn't there?
Yes, Wright actually knew the family, which just adds this whole other layer of, betrayal to the whole thing. This wasn't some random act of violence. There is a personal connection, however, twisted it was to his
Right,
victims.
so it wasn't just like a rage killing or something. There was some level of premeditation involved. And then to kidnap and assault Snelling's 5-year-old son,
Mm.
I mean, it's hard to even fathom that level of cruelty.
Yeah, absolutely. This act shows a complete disregard for human life and a really disturbing need for power and control. It's a stark reminder that evil can hide behind, the most ordinary facades.
And for Wright, this need for control seems to have stemmed from a very specific desire. He actually said his motive for the murders was that he always wanted a son.
And his words, they reveal a chillingly distorted perspective, like a total inability to empathize with the devastating consequences of his actions. He took lives, he destroyed a family, and all because he felt like he was entitled to have a child. It's pretty messed up.
It's really disturbing when you think about his history of, targeting young boys. Do you think there could be a connection there? I mean, could this fixation on having a son have fueled his predatory behavior?
It's definitely a question worth considering. While we can't say for sure that there's a direct causal link, the overlap is just too obvious to ignore. It points to like a warped sense of ownership and control, particularly when it comes to, young boys.
So after the murders, Wright ended up getting a 35-year sentence. But even prison couldn't stop his violence, could it?
No, not at all. As soon as he was released, he got involved in a bunch of armed robberies, each one more violent than the last and with more threats to kill. It's like his time in prison just made the rage and darkness inside him even worse.
It's almost terrifying how predictable the pattern is. But during this time, there was another horrible thing that happened. One that went unsolved for years: the abduction and murder of a 10-year-old boy named Luke Treadway.
Right, for 12 years, Luke's family had to live with the pain of not knowing what happened to their son. All the while, Wright was serving a 30-year sentence for the robberies. And his connection to Luke's case remained a secret. But his story doesn't end there. In 1991, he was released again. And this time, his crimes took an even darker turn.
This is when he started targeting homeless men, right?
Right.
Luring them with promises of work and then
Yeah.
driving them to these secluded areas.
And brutally murdering them.
Yeah. Anthony Barker, William Marks, William Davis, all killed execution style on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. He also tried to kill 2 other men, Anthony Shaw Nelson and Randy Scott Henry. But Henry, he managed to escape and contact the authorities.
It's really amazing that Henry was able to escape. I mean, it's because of his bravery that Wright was finally stopped. The similarities between all these murders, though, they point to a really cold and calculated approach. He wasn't just randomly lashing out, he was choosing his victims, and his method of killing was the same every time.
Yeah, that consistency, that methodical way of going about it, it's really disturbing. These weren't impulsive acts of violence, they were planned executions.
He was convicted of 3 of those murders, but he was linked to 7 in total. And there were hints that there might be even more victims out there, maybe even in other states.
It makes you wonder about the true extent of his crimes. How many other victims are there whose stories haven't been told? It's a pretty scary thought. Ultimately, he was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. But instead of appealing, he actually chose to speed up his execution.
Yeah, that decision to, basically give up any chance of reprieve, that's one of the most perplexing things about this case. What made him want to embrace his fate like that?
It's hard to imagine it was remorse, especially considering, everything he had done. So what was it?
Well, to understand that, I think we have to look at what happened right before his execution. That's when he sent this letter to the Oregonian, confessing to a crime that had haunted a community for over a decade.
Are you saying he confessed to Luke Treadway's murder? I mean, after all these years, after letting that family suffer,
Yeah.
he just decides to, come clean.
Yeah, that's right. Just a few weeks before his execution, Wright sent this letter to the Oregonian admitting that he kidnapped and killed 10-year-old Luke. It was a huge shock for the community, and it, reopened old wounds for Luke's family.
It's almost like he was trying to, control the story one last time to make sure people remembered him the way he wanted to be remembered. I mean, but why? Why would he do that?
Yeah.
What did he say his reason was for confessing after all those years?
In the letter, Wright claimed he wanted to do like one good thing before he died. He even gave this really strange invitation to Luke's family, suggesting they come watch his execution for closure. They obviously declined.
Oh, wow. I can't even imagine the range of emotions they must have been going through.
Uh-huh.
Relief at finally knowing what happened to their son, anger at the man who took him away from them, and then to be given this offer to watch him die. It's just all so disturbing.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation, with so many difficult questions. Was it a true act of remorse? Like maybe a last-ditch effort to find redemption before he died? Or was it, like you said, a final act of manipulation? A way to try and exert control even from death row?
I have a hard time believing that someone who did such horrible things could all of a sudden experience real remorse, you know?
Mm.
Especially since he confessed to crimes before, and it seemed like he was just trying to get ahead of the legal process. Could this confession just be another one of his strategies, another attempt to game the system?
That's a good point. Wright had a history of using information to his advantage, as a way to get what he wanted or stay in control. And this confession coming at such a crucial time, it definitely makes you suspicious.
Yeah, but the timing is also what makes it so interesting, He knew he was about to die, so what did he have to gain at that point? Was there something more to it, something deeper than just trying to manipulate everyone?
That's the question that I keep coming back to. Was there maybe even a tiny bit of guilt? A moment of recognizing the immense suffering he caused? Or was the confession just a way to make sure he wouldn't be forgotten, to sort of cement his infamy?
I guess we'll never really know for sure what was going on in his head. But it does make you think about the nature of evil. Can someone who commits such awful acts ever really understand how bad what they did was? Can they ever really change?
Those are really big questions, ones that philosophers and theologians have been debating for centuries. And in Wright's case, the answer is that I think they remain a mystery. We're left with this unsettling possibility that even facing death, his real motivations were still hidden in darkness.
But this need for control, for having things his way, that seems to be a common theme throughout his life. From abusing young boys to his reasons for killing the Rosenberries, he always had to be the one in charge, to have power over everyone around him.
Yeah, you're right. That need for control is a constant throughout his entire story. It's there in the victims he chose, his calculated way of killing, and even his decision to speed up his execution. He couldn't just accept his fate passively. He had to be the one to decide even in death.
So was this confession a final, twisted attempt at control? A way to manipulate how people would see his death, to make sure he and his story wouldn't just fade away?
It's a scary thought, but it's hard to completely rule it out. And it brings us right back to that main question. Why? Why confess after all this time?
Maybe it was a mix of things, Maybe there was some warped sense of guilt mixed with wanting to be in control one last time, like he was playing some kind of game even with his own death.
That's a pretty chilling idea, and it shows us that even in the darkest parts of the human mind, there can be a weird kind of logic, a twisted rationale that we might never fully understand.
Wright was executed in 1996, the first execution in Oregon in 34 years, and it was the state's first lethal injection execution. But even though he's gotten his story, it still affects us, doesn't it?
It really does, and maybe that's the most lasting part of his legacy. Douglas Franklin writes, a man who confessed to this terrible crime just weeks before his death and left behind so many unanswered questions. He makes us think about the very nature of evil and how complicated the human heart can be.
This deep dive has taken us to some pretty dark places. Wright's crimes were absolutely monstrous. His motives were confusing and disturbing. And his final act, that confession, just makes this already confusing case even more intriguing.
Yeah, we've looked at his difficult childhood, his increasingly violent behavior, his scary desire for control, and the question of his true motives. But what can we learn from a case like this? What can we take away from this deep dive into the mind of a serial killer?
It's like this idea of control keeps coming up. His crimes, his confession, even choosing to die sooner than later. Was it all about trying to hold on to a life that was, spinning out of control?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty strong argument, especially if you look at his early life, the lack of stability being abandoned, the abuse. It's almost like he was overcompensating for that lack of control by, dominating
That
others.
makes sense, actually. Like he was creating his own world where he made the rules and decided how things went.
Exactly. And his victims, they were often people who were already vulnerable, easy targets for his need to be in charge.
That also makes me think about his whole thing about wanting a son, you know? It wasn't just about having a family. It was about owning someone, completely having total power over another person.
You got it. And that desire on top of his history with young boys, well, it creates this really disturbing picture of his psychology. Like he really believed he had the right to take whatever he wanted, no matter who he hurt.
That's a really disturbing thought. And it just makes his confession about Luke Treadway even harder to figure out. Was he really trying to make things right, or was it another way to control the story to make sure people remembered him the way he wanted?
That's the question that sticks with you, even after looking at all the facts. Was there a little bit of regret, a real desire to fix things, or was it all calculated just one last power play from death row?
I don't know. It's really hard to imagine both of those things at the same time. The horrible things he did, they don't really match up with the idea of actually feeling sorry.
Hmm.
But confessing right before he was executed makes it seem like maybe there was something more to it.
Maybe it was a few things mixed together, like realizing he was going to die and then trying to find some humanity in himself before it was too late. Or, like we said, maybe it was a last move to control his story, to go out on his own terms.
I guess no matter what his reasons were, Douglas Franklin Wright
Mm.
left a lot of pain and unanswered questions behind. His case definitely shows us the dark side of humanity, how complicated evil can be, and how we always want to find answers, even when faced with terrible tragedies.
It also reminds us that violence is real, and we need to understand what causes it and try to learn more about the human mind, the good and the bad.
This deep dive has really been a trip into the darkest parts of human behavior. But by looking at that darkness, we also have to face our own vulnerabilities,
Mhm.
our own capacity for doing good or bad.
And maybe that's the biggest thing we can take away from this. By trying to understand cases like Douglas Franklin Wright's, we become more aware of the things that shape our world, how fragile life is, and how important compassion and understanding are, even when things are dark.
Thanks for joining us on this intense journey. Hopefully it sparked some curiosity in you and made you want to learn more about the crazy world of human behavior. Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we know about ourselves and the world around us, the better we can handle challenges and work towards a better future.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those brains working.